guys, it's Stoof. I hope you enjoyed that footage of our helicopter ride on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. It was amazing. I loved that helicopter ride. Those peaks are so steep. I've never seen such steep mountain peaks in my life before. It's just crazy how the water just erodes them away so quickly. They get so much rain on the island, and that's why those mountains are also covered with lush vegetation, so they're beautiful green sharp peaks. Gorgeous. I loved it. I went there in March of 2018, so now it's 2019 while I'm making this video. I wanted to share that footage with you before I showed you this painting that I'm creating. This painting was created referencing an image that you see in the upper right corner from Waimea Canyon. We didn't fly in the helicopter right over this canyon, but we flew over a lot of areas that looked similar topographically as you saw in the helicopter footage. We actually drove up to Waimea Canyon in a car that we rented. You get out of the car right on the side of the road and you have this gorgeous view of these giant waterfalls that look tiny because they're so far away, but those are several 100-foot waterfalls. Those are big waterfalls, and they got a lot of rain that year, so the water was rushing. Another beautiful thing about the land in Kauai is that the rocks all have a lot of iron in them, and they're super orange and saturated orange sienna brown. So I really wanted to paint that too because I love the contrast of that orange soil and rock in comparison to the lush green vegetation that covers a lot of the ground in other parts of the mountains there. Alright, now let's talk about this acrylic painting. This is just an 8" by 10" canvas panel. You can purchase them using the link in my description. You also can grab all of these colors of paint in my description section as well on my Amazon account. So to get started with this painting, I am dipping some of my blue with my brown, not really caring what color it is because I'm just sketching out the scene, but I'm dipping either the blue or the brown or a combo of both of them into the water to thin down that paint and let it give me a nice long line that I can work with so the paint's not drying and giving me that dry brush looking line. I'm watering it down so I can really drag out my lines just to sketch out the concept of this painting. And this was kind of a tough one to sketch out without using any type of a grid system. If you were a beginner, I would recommend using the grid method. You can see the grid method in some of my other videos where I'll sketch out a grid on the reference photo every inch or every 3 inches apart or something like that, making squares, and then I'll transfer that grid onto my canvas and then look at what is in each square of the grid on the photo and sketch that out onto my canvas. Then I know everything's accurate moving forward. But for this one, just wanted to make it more of a fun little painting to just have a memory of Waimea Canyon up on my wall in my home. If you're not using the grid method, something that can help you out is just to eyeball how far up the top of your mountain is. So if you look at the reference photo and we divide it into thirds from bottom to top, the top 1/3 of the painting appears to be sky. So that's about where I drew my line where the sky is going to meet our mountains. And then if we look at it from left to right, it's about a quarter. The left quarter is mostly trees. So that's another way to look at it, is just eyeball about how much of the canvas is being taken up by which concept or which piece of the painting. After I got it sketched out quickly, I started to fill in the background, which is my sky, and I started out with that warmer blue, that sky blue mixed with some white, and then added more of my cobalt blue as I moved farther up into the sky, using a flat-tipped brush, just making back and forth brush strokes, blending my colors in and moving up, getting darker as the sky is getting higher up to the top of the canvas. After I get the sky completely blue, I start to work on my mountains and I let that blue sky dry before I go back and add my clouds. Alright, now we're ready to start working on those mountains. We're going to start with the mountains that are the farthest in the background, and those mountains are going to have the least amount of saturation. They're going to be closer to the color in the sky, so they're going to have a little more blue. They're not going to have a lot of dark blacks and shadow tones. They're going to have more white mixed in. They're going to have less color, like I said before. So we're starting out that range way far in the distance. You can barely see it in the reference photo right now. And then we're going to make our way forward, getting closer and closer to the foreground. And as we move closer to the foreground, our mountains are going to have stronger shadows. As you can see in the reference photo, the mountains closer to the waterfall have darker shadows and more contrast between light and dark than on the far right, that shadow in the background there. We're going to be adding some puffy white clouds up in our sky, and those clouds are creating shadows on the mountains. So some areas of the mountains have cooler shades where they're in shadow from the clouds, and others are highlighted. So I am using lighter, warmer shades of green in the areas that are lit by the sunlight, and then the areas that are in the shadow of clouds have more shadows. And we also have some shadows from our sunlight location. So the sun is pretty high up in the sky, but it is producing some shadows because it is behind that waterfall there. So the area surrounding the waterfall is in shadow just from the mountain. As I'm beginning to paint the mountain peaks that are closer to us, we start to see more of the red rock exposed and a little bit less vegetation. So I am using a blend of reds and blues and browns to make a cooler purple brown shade for the area of the mountain where the rock is exposed and it's in shadow. And then I'm using more oranges and warm colors for the areas that are lit by the sun. For now, I'm starting to add a little bit of those horizontal rock layers that we can see, just minor details in some spots where those are really visible, and we have a significant shadow right along that bedding plane of the rocks. But I'm not going too crazy with the detail just yet. I'm mostly trying to work on getting base colors for the different parts of the mountain. Okay, I've made it close enough to the front where I'm starting to work on that mountain that has that bright orange sienna color. and I'm using that as my base color. And there's a little bit of another cliff there closer to us that's mostly covered by the tree on the left hand side in the foreground, so I just use a little bit of pink and purplish shades in there to kind of show where that cliff starts. That's going to mostly get covered up later. And I'm working on defining my borders of this cliff, slope, whatever we want to call it, that's right in front of us here. Rather than paint these slopes one solid color and then go back to add detail, I thought I would save some time by mixing and blending and making shades for each little part of that slope where we see more orange and then more beige, more orange, more brown, and the areas with more vegetation and green on them, and just kind of making base colors for each section of that slope, where I'll go back and add a little more detail later, but I kind of skipped a step to save some time. I could have just made it all one solid color and then started to add detail for each section and then add more detail on top of that. So there are a couple different ways you could approach this type of painting. Alright, for our waterfall, I started with just a cooler blue shade just to outline where that waterfall is going to be placed. Now I'm going back with some white and a little bit of gray, a little bit of blue, but blended in, because we don't want to use pure white because it's farther away. There is some haziness in there. It's not quite as bright and contrasty as it would be if it were right in front of us. So I'm cooling it down a little, making it a little less contrast with the mountain right below it and behind it. And I also outlined the edges of that waterfall where we have the shadow of the falls to the left of it, and with some cooler blue shades. And I'm starting to work on some more details of the shadows and the exposed rock right around that waterfall. Okay, now we're ready to work on our clouds in the sky. We have nice big puffy white clouds. I copied them pretty close to the reference image, but I changed them up a little bit based on where I thought they should be placed to make it look nice in the painting. I started out with a gray shade that was a little cooler, had some alizarin crimson, cool red, and cooler blue mixed with white and black. And then I started to build up my highlights on the puffy clouds, and then also build in those shadows. So there's a lot of layering with clouds to make them nice and puffy, and you don't have a lot of solid, you don't have any straight lines, you don't have any solid lines. They're all kind of blendy and puffy in these style clouds, at least. Sometimes we do get clouds that have a solid white contrast line against the blue background, but in these clouds they're kind of puffy and just all breaking apart from all that humidity in the sky. And doing the same process for all of the clouds, starting with that cooler gray shade, building up my whites, and then starting to go back and add some shadows, and then building up those whites another time to make them have that same kind of look that we have in our reference image. To give the appearance that some of these clouds are just breaking away off into the sky and have like a sweeping up, evaporating type of appearance, I watered down my paint. So I dipped my brush in the water, dipped it back in the paint, took the excess paint off the brush on my little napkin, and so there's just a little bit of a wet brush with a little bit of paint on it, and then I just did a nice little sweeping motions going up into the blue sky off from the edges of the cloud, just to make that cloud look like it's just breaking away into the sky. And after I did that, that gave me like a nice kind of translucent light color where the clouds are breaking apart. Then I took some white paint without any water added, just some nice thick acrylic white paint, and I touched up the highlights and blended the highlight in to that section so it gave a nice blended look. Now I'm working on adding more detail to the slope that is making its way towards the foreground there. I'm increasing the saturation by adding more orange and warm burnt sienna to the rock, and I'm adding some shadows as well. Now I'm starting to work on the vegetation in the foreground. So for the vegetation in the foreground, I started with my shadow color first and just kind of let the brush dance freely, adding leaves and some stems. After I had everything down with the shadow color, I started to add some highlights with my warmer greens and yellows, a little bit of orange mixed in there too. And then to add a little bit of variety in my greens in the foreground, I used some cooler greens and added a little bit of blue in there just to mix up between the different plants so we can tell the difference between the plants there. The greens in the reference photograph don't vary quite as much as they do in my painting, but I think it's important to be able to show the difference between each plant there in the foreground, so I mixed up my greens a little bit. Next, I started to outline or just kind of sketch out the limbs on the tree branches that are up in the left foreground. That tree there, I started to add some leaves loosely once I had my limbs planned out, and then I started to go back with some highlight colors, more of like a middle ground highlight and then a brighter highlight on top of that too, to really boost the contrast since this plant is so close to us and the sun is hitting it. Here I'm working on adding more detail to that mountainy slope that is behind the plants in the foreground. I am continuing to build up the contrast in these units. You can see the geology is a little different here, where we have that about 20 to 30 degree angle slope where it's more brown, and then the other areas above and below it are more orange. So I'm working on getting those rock bedding layers all figured out here, trying to show the drainage, how the water drains down and creates these little divots and shadows in the rock, and adding the vegetation on top where the green plants are starting to grow. Just trying to capture those same details that are in my reference photo into the painting. Now I'm at the point in the painting where everything is recognizable. We can see there's a sense of depth. We can see that there's some plants right up in the foreground here. We can see there's a waterfall very far away. We kind of have a sense of the geology as well. But now I'm starting to go back in and just add smaller details to everywhere all over the painting. I am adding more of the bedding and darkening my shadows in the rocks. Just trying to make things match a little closer to the values that are in the reference photograph. I did want to change my plants in the foreground and really boost the contrast because I thought they looked a little flat in comparison with the rocks behind them. I wanted the plants in the foreground to kind of draw you in and really stand out, and the way that I did that was increasing the contrast, so making the shadows darker and the highlights brighter. Here I'm just wrapping things up, adding those final last details for this painting. This painting took approximately 2 hours from start to finish on an 8" by 10" canvas panel, so not too long, pretty quick little guy. So thank you guys for watching. I'm going to show you the reference photograph and then the painting right now.